This church, any church, is of the grace of God. It begins with God's grace, it ends with God's grace. This passage is so rich because you don't leave this passage saying, well, the church gets built by somebody else. The church just gets built by osmosis. It just happens because God does it. You don't leave thinking that, because you leave saying, we have a part in this. We have something that we need to do, that we have to do. And yet you certainly don't leave this saying that it all rides on us. Oh no, the exact opposite. We leave this passage appreciating the grace of God. Because think about it, it's not just that Paul plants, Apollos waters, and God gives the harvest, so it's like a three-part operation. Paul says, even before I planted, God's grace was at work in me. God's grace came to me. God's grace worked through me. It begins with God's grace. And then it ends with the work of God's grace as well. So look at verses 5 through 7. You see in verse 5 that the Lord assigned to each. So even those who are building, even those who are planting, those who are watering, still God has assigned that to them. Verse 6, it's the Lord that gave growth. Verse 7, God is the one who gives growth. If you need further convincing, look at verse 10. Paul says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building on it. So Paul is seeing even his work as a skilled master builder is because God has gifted him. God has graced him, given him grace so that he might be a skilled master builder. So as we're thinking about this, we're thinking about investment. Investment begins with God because it's by the grace of God. Two things that are clear. Number one is this: if it is by God's grace, then clearly it's for God's glory. I mean, if it begins with God and it ends with God, if it's from God, through God, and to God, then who in the world would stand up and say, it's all about me? No, we would say, it's about God. God is the one who is at work. God is the one who is to receive glory. But I want you to notice this as well. This is so important for everyone here. Everyone who's part of a local church needs to see this clearly. There's so much here what Paul talks about, it kind of cuts both ways. And notice here that God's grace is both enabling for the individual. So Paul wouldn't tell you, I'm a master builder because I'm so skilled. No, he would say, God gave me grace. It's that grace that I've received from God, therefore I build. So both God's grace was given to him to enable him to build, and God's grace is used in his building to edify the body. God's grace both enables the service, and God's grace then edifies the body through that service. Paul saw that God's grace was given to him so that he would build, and he sees God's grace given to him that he might bless the church. So maybe you could see it this way. It cuts like this. One is that the means of grace you receive from God to serve. That's one way. But then that service also cuts so that it is then grace to others. So maybe the easiest way to think of it is like this. You are first the object of grace, and then you become the instrument of grace. That's what you should write down. If you're taking notes and you just want to get this point down to its very essence, you are first the object of God's grace. God's grace comes to you, and then you become the instrument of God's grace. God's grace flows through you. That's why we say around here, we're not reservoirs of grace. We are channels of grace. We receive it, and then God is using it to minister to others.